War has a cruel sense of humor. The side that moves fuel, repairs rails, and keeps trucks rolling usually wins the day. It's not glamorous. It's not cinematic. And it's definitely not the part that gets the recruitment posters. But reality is the opposite in the Russia-Ukraine war. Because right now, Moscow is saying it just grabbed 2 more villages and simultaneously hit Ukraine with broad collective strikes aimed straight at the systems that keep an army alive. Here's the claim. Russia's defense ministry says its forces took Kucherivka in Ukraine's northern Kharkiv region and Rivne in the eastern Donetsk region. Same statement, same day. They also say they struck transport infrastructure, fuel and energy facilities, military airfields, and Ukraine's long-range drone complexes. That's a wide net. And if the timing is real, it's not a coincidence. And before you shrug and go, 2 villages? That's exactly how wars sneak up on people. This is only the surface. In this video, you'll see 3 things. Why these tiny place names still matter. Why infrastructure targeting is a pressure campaign that can outlast a battlefield win. And how the last few weeks of developments point to a dangerous spiral that neither side fully controls. First, map logic, because geography is the quiet boss of every battlefield. Kharkiv region sits in Ukraine's northeast, pressed up near the Russian border. And it's been a recurring flashpoint because it threatens 2 things at once. The stability of northern Ukrainian defenses and the routes feeding the Eastern Front. Donetsk, meanwhile, is the grinding centerpiece of the war in the east, where towns and tree lines become months-long arguments settled by artillery and attrition. So yes, a village can matter, not because it has a skyline or an airport, but because it can sit on a road, a river crossing, or a slightly higher ridge that changes artillery range. It can become a stepping stone for reserves, a place to stage drones, or a wedge that fractures a defensive line just enough to force a withdrawal from the next position. War loves small advantages, because small advantages compound. And this is where the sarcasm kicks in. If you want to know what a side really cares about, don't watch the speeches, watch what they try to break. Hitting transport infrastructure is an attempt to slow the flow of ammunition, spare parts, and reinforcements. Hitting fuel and energy is about limiting mobility and forcing trade-offs. Does power go to civilian heat, industry, or military logistics? Targeting military airfields is about reducing sortie rates and pushing aircraft farther back, which increases burn rate for maintenance and decreases time on station. And striking long-range drone complexes, if that's accurate, is about blunting Ukraine's ability to reach deep targets that create political pressure and operational disruption. It's hybrid warfare logic. You don't only fight the soldiers, you fight the machine that keeps them fed, warm, and connected. Now, uncertainty box, because we're not doing fantasy roleplay here. What's claimed? Russia says it captured Kucherivka and Rivne and carried out those wide collective strikes. What's more broadly confirmed by public reporting, there have been major waves of attacks in recent days hitting infrastructure, including power and water disruptions in places like industrial hubs, and continued fighting and shelling around frontline regions. What remains unclear? The exact extent of damage to specific long-range drone complexes, and whether those 2 village claims reflect durable control or the kind of shifting, gray zone occupation where one side plants a flag and the other side targets the road into town. If you're wondering why that ambiguity matters, here's the twist. These village announcements often function like a morale and messaging weapon as much as a tactical report. They can pressure Ukrainian command decisions, nudge foreign audiences, and create the impression of inevitability. They didn't expect you to notice how the information war and the kinetic war are stacked together like 2 blades in the same handle. Now let's talk systems pressure and winter, because winter doesn't care about anyone's talking points. When energy facilities get hit, you don't just lose lights. You lose repair capacity, rail throughput, telecom resilience. and the ability to keep factories producing, you also get the human factor. Cold apartments, exhausted repair crews, and a society asked to endure just a little more again and again. That's where morale enters, not as propaganda, but as math. If you're cold, tired, and you can't trust the grid, your sense of stability fractures. And if you're the military, you start making ugly choices. Keep air defense near cities, or shift it toward the front. Protect power nodes, or protect ammo dumps. Prioritize rail nodes, or protect bridges. Every choice creates a gap. That's the point of a pressure campaign. Over the last few weeks, public reporting has repeatedly pointed to intensified long-range attack waves and counterstrikes aimed at energy and logistics. We've seen reports of large drone and missile barrages causing outages and disruption in multiple regions, alongside Ukrainian strikes reaching into Russian territory or Russian-occupied areas, targeting energy-related sites or facilities linked to drone operations. Why does that matter? Because it signals both sides are leaning harder into a contest of endurance, not just territory. We've also seen a diplomatic drumbeat ramp up in recent days, with renewed high-level contacts and talk of frameworks, proposals, and near deals. That matters because negotiations don't stop fighting. They often increase it as each side tries to improve leverage before any freeze line hardens. When people whisper ceasefire, the battlefield often answers with not yet. Another development. Reporting suggests growing focus on the safety and power needs around major nuclear facilities, especially as infrastructure damage and grid instability complicate risk management. That matters because even a non-catastrophic incident becomes a strategic hostage, something both sides can use to warn, pressure, and shape foreign decision-making. We've also seen ongoing debate in allied capitals about sustained support, stockpiles, and air defense availability as winter strain rises. That matters because attrition isn't only about troops and tanks. It's about interceptors, transformers, and the boring parts that run out at the worst time. If air defense stocks thin, then each attack wave becomes more chaotic, and repairs become more dangerous. And then there's the shadow layer. Continued reporting about sanctions enforcement, shipping workarounds, and energy revenues. That matters because the war's burn rate is tied to cash flow and supply chains. And both sides are trying to manipulate that equation, one with restrictions, the other with evasions. You don't need to win the economy. You just need the other guy's economy to stumble. Now let's build the risk ladder, because this is the part people skip until it's too late. If this continues, step one is obvious. More strikes mean more outages and slowed logistics. Step two is operational. Slowed logistics mean fewer shells delivered, fewer vehicles repaired, and more local retreats under pressure. Step three is political. Rising civilian strain creates louder arguments inside Ukraine and among partners about priorities and terms. Step four is military. If air defense and repair capacity get stretched, the frontline posture weakens, and small village gains can suddenly cascade. Step five is the worst one. A spiral where each side escalates infrastructure targeting to break the other's will, risking miscalculation and long-term damage that outlasts any line on a map. And here's the uncomfortable part. Even if you hate infrastructure targeting, the cold logic is clear. You can grind the front line for meters, or you can try to make the enemy's meters impossible to hold by attacking the systems behind them. That doesn't automatically work, but it can create moral rot in decision-making, where leaders start seeing civilian hardship as just another lever, not cheering for it, not excusing it, just naming the mechanism. So what about those two villages, specifically? In Kharkiv region, any Russian advance, even a small one, forces Ukraine to keep manpower and surveillance tied down in the north. It also threatens routes that support eastern defenses, even if indirectly. In Donetsk, every village is potentially a staging point toward more significant lines, especially if it helps artillery coverage or opens a cleaner approach to larger towns and junctions. But we need to be honest. Without independent confirmation, control can mean different things. It can mean troops physically entered and raised a flag. It can mean they can fire on the roads and claim denial. Or it can mean they're in, but vulnerable, and the next 72 hours decide whether it sticks. Public reporting cannot confirm this yet in granular detail, and details remain unclear. Now for the cliffhanger you're going to want to stick around for, because it's the hidden risk behind infrastructure targeting. The obvious risk is outages and hardship. The less obvious risk is cascading failure. When power goes down, repair logistics slow, water systems strain, communications degrade, and emergency response becomes slower. That's when a country doesn't just suffer, it starts to wobble. And wobbling is when mistakes happen. And that leads directly into what experts warn happens next. Once both sides normalize hitting the systems behind the front, the threshold for what counts as military-linked expands. Today, it's transport nodes and fuel. Tomorrow, it's anything that looks like a connector between society and defense. They didn't expect how quickly that definition can spread. You can almost hear the gears grinding when a war shifts from frontline gains to system collapse bets. Because once you start talking about transport nodes, fuel networks, airfields, and long-range drone infrastructure in the same breath, you're not just fighting for land. You're trying to win by exhaustion, by chaos, by turning every repair crew into a frontline unit. And that's the hidden risk behind infrastructure targeting. It doesn't stay neatly military. It bleeds outward, fractures routines, and forces civilians into the math of war whether they asked for it or not. That's how a pressure campaign quietly becomes a long-term moral rot problem, because the temptation is always the same. If we can't break the trenches, we'll break the lights. Now, the core claim we're tracking is still the same. Russia says it took Kucherivka in Kharkiv region and Rivne in Donetsk. And it says it hit transport infrastructure, fuel and energy facilities, military airfields, and Ukraine's long-range drone complexes. Remember the uncertainty box from earlier, because it matters more in this section. On the village side, it's common for control to mean anything from temporary presence to actual consolidation. On the strike side, damage claims are notoriously messy, because both sides have incentives to inflate success and downplay vulnerability. But here's what recent public reporting does support. In the past days and weeks, there have been major waves of long-range attacks hitting Ukrainian infrastructure, including reports of power and water disruptions in industrial hubs. At the same time, there's been continuing reporting that Ukraine is sustaining a long-range drone campaign targeting Russia's oil and energy-related facilities, aiming to squeeze revenue and impose costs. Put those together and you get a hybrid contest where each side tries to jam the other's ability to keep fighting, not just outshoot them. Let's bring the map logic back, because it connects directly to the strike logic. Kharkiv region is a northern anchor point. Even a small push there forces Ukraine to spread air defense, electronic warfare, and reserves across a wider arc, which increases burn rate and opens gaps somewhere else. Donetsk is the attrition furnace. If a village in Donetsk changes hands, it can shift local artillery geometry, open or close a supply road, or create just enough uncertainty to pull a battalion off a more critical sector. And yes, it still sounds small. That's because the war's real action often isn't the name on the map. It's the line of communication behind it. A single junction can decide whether you move ammo at night in a steady stream or in panicked bursts. A single bridge can decide whether reinforcements arrive as a plan or as a late apology. Now we need to talk about the last few weeks in a quick context reel, because the pattern matters more than any one headline. First development. Public reporting describes large-scale attack waves that hit Ukrainian infrastructure and caused outages and disruptions, including power and water interruptions in industrial areas. That matters because it shows the strike campaign is aiming at endurance, not just spectacle. Second development. There's reporting that Ukraine has been escalating long-range drone strikes against Russian energy and oil infrastructure, with some assessments suggesting meaningful disruption, while others caution public numbers are often exaggerated. That matters because revenue and fuel are war oxygen. And if either side believes the other is vulnerable, the targeting will intensify. Third development. There's been renewed high-level diplomatic activity and talk of frameworks, with public reporting describing multiple days of discussions without a clear breakthrough. That matters because when diplomacy hovers, battlefield actions often spike, as each side tries to reshape leverage before any pause line hardens. Fourth development. Public reporting continues to highlight Ukraine's air defense strain and the challenge of intercepting massed drones and missiles over time. That matters because even a strong air defense posture becomes an attrition problem when attack volumes rise and interceptor stocks are finite. And once protection thins, infrastructure becomes easier to hit. Fifth development. Reporting has again raised concerns around nuclear site safety and the role of stable external power for maintaining safe conditions, especially as grid stress increases. That matters because the consequences of a serious incident wouldn't respect front lines, and even smaller disruptions can trigger political shockwaves. Sixth development. There are continuing reports of disputes and pressure around shipping, sanctions enforcement, and energy export workarounds tied to wartime financing. That matters because the economic layer feeds the military layer. And when that pipeline gets squeezed or rerouted, the incentives to escalate can spiral. Seventh development. And this one is easy to miss. Reports have described strikes and counterstrikes extending into regions not traditionally seen as frontline, including energy-related maritime infrastructure and facilities linked to export routes. That matters because once you normalize expanding target sets, you raise escalation risk and create a wider zone of uncertainty where accident becomes a convenient word. If you're thinking, okay, but what's the direct military logic behind hitting transport, fuel and energy, airfields, and long-range drone sites? It's brutally simple. Transport is your bloodstream. Hit it and everything slows. Fuel and energy is your nervous system. Hit it and everything becomes unreliable. Airfields are your reach and response. Push them back and you reduce operational tempo. Long-range drone infrastructure is your asymmetric lever. Crimp it and you reduce the enemy's ability to impose costs deep behind the front. Here's the part they didn't expect. These targets don't just reduce capability, they reshape decision-making. When your logistics are stressed, commanders get cautious, then reactive. Reactive forces bleed more because they arrive late, fight tired, and run out of options faster. That is how attrition turns from a statistic into a mood. But we have to keep our uncertainty box alive as we interpret this. Claimed, collective strikes hit all those categories, and 2 villages were captured. Confirmed by public reporting at a broader level. There have been significant long-range attacks causing infrastructure disruption, and Ukraine has continued long-range drone operations aimed at Russia's energy sector. Unclear. The specific extent of damage to long-range drone complexes, and whether the village claims represent stable control or a temporary incursion followed by contested fighting. Now, let's zoom into the winter layer, because winter is the multiplier nobody can negotiate with. When energy is unstable, repairs become harder and morale becomes more brittle. Military endurance is tied to civilian endurance because they share the same rails, the same transformers, and the same repair crews. If you disrupt electricity, you disrupt manufacturing and maintenance. If you disrupt fuel distribution, you disrupt evacuation, logistics, and generator supply. If you disrupt transport, you disrupt everything that's just in time. And war is already the enemy of just in time. This is where the hidden risk behind infrastructure targeting really bites. The first-order effect is outages. The second-order effect is cascading strain on hospitals, water pumping, heating, rail switching, and communications. The third-order effect is political fracture. Arguments over priorities, blame, and what's sustainable. That fracture can be exploited, amplified, and weaponized. That's the hybrid angle again. Not just bombs, but doubt, And yes, this can boomerang. Infrastructure warfare invites retaliation, and retaliation invites escalation. Each side then tries to outrun the other's repair cycle, which can create a spiral where the goal quietly shifts from military advantage to societal pressure. That's the danger line, because once a war becomes about breaking the other side's ability to function, it becomes harder to stop without someone feeling humiliated. So what does "if this continues" look like now? Specifically, step 1. More strikes keep stressing the grid and transport nodes. Step 2. Air defense gets triaged harder, protecting some cities and leaving others exposed. Step 3. Logistics slow down, and the frontline posture becomes more dependent on local stockpiles. Step 4. Local collapses become more likely because reserves move slower and arrive later. Step 5. The political space shrinks, and leaders become more willing to gamble on escalation to avoid seeming weak. Now, let's talk about what experts warn happens next, because this is where people who've watched modern wars get uneasy. One warning is that infrastructure targeting creates incentives for preemption. You hit first because you assume you'll get hit anyway. Another warning is that expanding target definitions makes it easier to justify riskier strikes, including near-sensitive sites or critical choke points. A third warning is that sustained pressure on air defenses changes the cost-benefit equation of attack waves. If interceptors are scarce, massed drones become more effective, and the temptation to keep launching them grows. And there's a nasty psychological layer too. When people live under intermittent power and constant alerts, time feels distorted, decisions become impulsive, trust erodes. That's when misinformation finds easy hosts. And a society's sense of control can fracture even if its army holds the line. Now, bring it back to those two villages, because the ground war still matters. If Russia can demonstrate repeatable advances in Donetsk, it can claim momentum and force Ukraine to spend more resources stabilizing sectors that are already strained. If pressure in Kharkiv persists, it forces Ukraine to keep assets spread wide, including air defense, surveillance drones, and reserves that might otherwise reinforce the east. You don't need a breakthrough everywhere. You need enough pressure in enough places to create decision paralysis. But again, we separate claimed from confirmed. Claimed. Control of Kucherivka and Rivne. Confirmed. Heavy fighting continues across the relevant regions, and the strike pattern against infrastructure has intensified in waves. Unclear whether these claims mark a durable shift in the line or just another churn event in a war defined by churn. Here's your retention hook before we close this section. The next phase may not be decided by who captures the next village, but by who survives the repair race. Because the side that restores power faster moves fuel smarter and keeps morale from collapsing, can absorb pressure without cracking. And if one side's repair cycle slows just a little, that's when a small village becomes a big story. And the cliffhanger you're waiting for is still sitting right there, blinking like a warning light. The hidden risk behind infrastructure targeting isn't just damage, it's escalation through cascading failure, where one broken node triggers another. And suddenly, you're not managing a war, you're managing a national emergency on repeat. And what experts warn happens next is that both sides may double down precisely because the pain is working, even if the long-term consequences are ugly. At some point in every long war, the battlefield stops being the battlefield. The real fight moves into substations, rail switches, fuel depots, runway repair kits, and the tired hands of crews who haven't slept properly in months. And if Russia's latest claims are even half true, this is exactly where the war is leaning right now. 2 more village names added to the tally, and a broad strike package aimed at the organs, not the limbs. Russia says it sees Kucherivka in the northern Kharkiv region and Rivne in eastern Donetsk. In the same breath, it says it launched collective strikes on transport infrastructure, fuel and energy facilities, military airfields, and Ukraine's long-range drone complexes on paper. That reads like a checklist for strangling an opponent's endurance. But here's the part that always gets people. Endurance isn't just a military issue, it's a civilian one. If transport goes down, supplies slow. If energy goes down, repairs slow. If repairs slow, everything else slows, and the whole system starts to wobble in a way that looks like chaos from the outside and feels like a fracture on the inside. Recent public reporting backs the broader pattern of what these strikes are trying to do. In the last few days, there were reports of a massive wave of drones and missiles hitting Ukrainian infrastructure, including energy targets, with outages and disruptions reported in an industrial hub where power and water were affected. That matters because it's not just about damage today. It's about making tomorrow's logistics unreliable. And winter is the perfect amplifier for that. Over the last month, analysts have also described Russia escalating attacks on energy and gas infrastructure, with warnings that heating and basic services can be stressed heading into the cold. That matters because winter pressure doesn't need a total blackout to bite. It just needs persistent instability that forces rationing, delays, and hard choices. Now, flip it around, because this is not a one-way street. Public reporting over the last month says Ukraine has ramped up long-range drone strikes against Russian energy infrastructure, with the frequency described as the highest since the full-scale invasion, aiming to hit revenue and force costs. That matters because once both sides treat energy and fuel as legitimate leverage, you get a pressure campaign contest where each side tries to outlast the other's repair cycle. And if you want a concrete sign of that escalation, public reporting described Ukraine carrying out a record number of refinery strikes in November. That matters because refineries aren't just money. They're logistics. And hitting them is an attempt to mess with the other side's burn rate, even if the effects are uneven and sometimes hard to verify in real time. Now, let's do the honesty check, because this channel doesn't do wishful thinking. What's claimed? 2 villages captured and a broad set of targets hit. What's confirmed in a general sense? There have been major strike waves and infrastructure disruptions recently, plus continued long-range drone activity against energy-related facilities on the Russian side. What remains unclear? Whether the specific villages are under durable control and whether long-range drone complexes were actually degraded in a meaningful way. Because battle damage assessment is notoriously messy and public reporting cannot confirm this yet at fine resolution. Here's the key operational logic, and it's cruelly simple. If you can't force a clean breakthrough in Kharkiv or Donetsk, you try to make the defense expensive to maintain. Transport strikes slow the movement of reserves, ammunition, and repair parts. Energy strikes make it harder to run factories, to keep trains moving, to pump water, and to power communications. Airfield strikes push aviation farther from the front and reduce operational tempo. And strikes on long-range drone infrastructure aim to blunt the opponent's ability to hit deep targets that impose political and economic costs. This is where the war becomes hybrid in the most uncomfortable way. The front line is still there, but the fight is also about whether a city can keep lights on, whether rail can keep rolling, and whether people can keep believing their system won't collapse. If you're cold, exhausted, and your routine is constantly interrupted, the psychological spiral starts quietly. Then suddenly, they didn't expect how fast that spiral can spread once it starts, because you don't need total collapse to lose momentum. You just need enough disruption that every plan turns into improvisation. Improvisation turns into delay. Delay turns into mistakes. Mistakes turn into attrition. Now, what about the villages themselves, and why do they matter if they're small? In Kharkiv, even small advances force Ukraine to allocate surveillance, air defense attention, and reserves across a broader arc near a sensitive border zone. That matters because spreading defenses thin increases vulnerability somewhere else, and the war is already a constant triage exercise. In Donetsk, small villages are often the hinges of local geometry. Control can expand or compress artillery range, change which roads are safe at night, and affect how quickly units can rotate. That matters because rotation is not a luxury. It's how you prevent exhaustion from turning into collapse. But here's the warning-focused sarcasm, because it's earned. Both sides have gotten very good at making small sound like nothing right up until it isn't. A couple of villages can be a rounding error, or it can be the first crack that widens once the logistics behind the line start to fail. Now, we climb the risk ladder one last time because the third section has to end with clarity, not vibes. If this continues, first you see more outages and slowed transport. Then you see harder air defense triage and widening gaps. Then you see delayed reinforcements and thinner stockpiles at the front. Then you see localized retreats become more likely, even without a dramatic breakthrough. And then you see political pressure intensify as societies absorb repeated disruption and begin arguing about what's sustainable. This is also where the hidden risk behind infrastructure targeting becomes more than a phrase. The hidden risk is cascading failure. Power disruptions can impair water systems, rail signaling, communications, medical capacity, and industrial repair. Once multiple systems start failing together, you're not just damaging infrastructure, you're stressing governance. And stressed governance is where miscalculation lives. Experts also warn about a second hidden risk: escalation through expanding definitions. Today, it's military-linked transport and energy facilities. Tomorrow, anything that supports resilience becomes a target by interpretation. That's how escalation sneaks forward, while each side insists it's still being limited. And yes, there's a third risk, and it's the scariest one: sensitive sites. When power stability becomes uncertain, concerns rise around safety-critical facilities that require reliable electricity and competent maintenance under pressure. Even without catastrophic outcomes, the political shock of a serious incident would be enormous. And that makes the entire theater more volatile. Details remain unclear on how close the current strikes and counterstrikes are to creating that kind of situation, but the risk climbs in winter condition. So, where does that leave us on today's claim? It leaves us in the uncomfortable middle. The village captures may be real, temporary, contested, or symbolic. Public reporting cannot confirm this yet. The strike campaign against infrastructure is real in its broad pattern and has been causing visible disruption. And the counter-campaign against Russian energy assets is also real in its broad pattern and appears to be intensifying. Together, they point to a war that's trying to win by wearing down the other side's ability to function. And here's your final hook, because this is the part people miss while staring at maps. The next breakthrough might not be a tank column. It might be a week where repairs can't keep up, where the burn rate outpaces replacement, and where the pressure campaign finally forces a decision that looks military on the outside but is really about endurance on the inside.